now that we finished reading through Jonah chapter 1, I'd like to just review the details of the story here. Now, first he's told by the Lord to go to a mission to Assyria, to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, in northern Iraq. He doesn't want to go. He runs away in a different direction, taking a boat. Storm comes on the sea, and he is asleep in the bottom of the boat during the storm. The sailors are afraid the ship is going to be lost and they'll all die, so they wake up Jonah and ask him to call on his God, and then they question him. They draw lots and decide that it was Jonah was the one responsible for this terrible thing happening. And reluctantly, in fear in the storm, they cast Jonah overboard because he tells them that's the only way that they can be saved. Jonah is swallowed up by a huge sea creature, and some translators will say it's a sea monster of some type, or some will say it's a whale or a giant fish. When Jesus quotes, he quotes from the Old Testament in the Greek version, which in the word that's used there, Jerome, the famous Bible translator, said that's a word that means whale. So many people think of that as a whale that swallowed Jonah, but it was a large sea creature, definitely. The storm ends, the sailors fear God, and then Jonah is in the belly, somewhere in the middle of the whale, for 3 days and 3 nights. So that's what we have so far in the story. And let's take a look at this and reflect on what we can learn from this. I mean, the first lesson, there's an obvious lesson here. Jonah, it says he tries to run away from the presence of the Lord. That's foolish. You can't run away from God. God is everywhere. You're not going to get away with anything. Let's look at the significance of what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 22 now. Now, if Jonah is representing Jesus in this story, let's take another look at all of the elements of what's just happened here. This would reflect, if the 3 days and 3 nights in the fish represents the time that Jesus spent after he died in Hades, then this time right before that might represent the time before Jesus died. So let's look at the parallels between Jesus and Jonah in the story. First of all, the obvious one that we started off with is the main character is a Jewish prophet from Galilee, from the Nazareth area. He's set apart by God to call on a dangerous, daring, far-reaching mission. And its stake was the repentance and salvation of thousands of Gentiles. The prophet here does not want to go on this mission and tries hard to get out of it. Now, we may not think about Jesus this way, but I want you to consider what it says in Luke chapter 22, right before Jesus died and he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane. In Luke chapter 22, I'm going to start reading in verse 39. It says, "Coming out, he went out to the Mount of Olives as he was accustomed, and his disciples also followed him. When he came to the place, he said to them, 'Pray that you may not enter into temptation.' He was withdrawn from them about a stone's throw. He knelt down and prayed, saying, 'Father, if it is your will, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done.' Then an angel appeared to him in heaven and strengthened him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. When he rose up from prayer, came to his disciples, he found them sleeping from sorrow. Then he said to them, 'Why do you sleep? Rise and pray, lest you enter into temptation.'" So Jesus also was very reluctant to go on the mission. He prayed passionately that God would take the mission of the cross away from him, but he ultimately submitted to God's will in that. So that's another parallel, is he was called to go on a mission that he was very reluctant to undertake. And after the wake-up call here in the Garden of Gethsemane, we see the disciples waking up. They're falling asleep. And hereafter, Jonah is woken up things escalate very rapidly. Jonah is asked 3 questions, and I want us to pay attention to what those 3 questions are. He's asked, what is your occupation? He's asked, where do you come from? Meaning, what country and people do you come from? And finally, what did you do to bring this about? Jesus, before his death, when he's brought before Pilate, when Jesus is questioned in John 18, verse 37, he's asked, are you a king? Jonah's asked, what's your occupation? Jesus asked, are you a king? The second question he's asked, where are you from? From what region and what people? In John chapter 19, verse 10. And then the third question Jesus is asked by Pilate. In John 18, verse 35, Pilate says, he sees the crowd that wants to kill him, and he says, what did you do? The same question that Jonah was asked. And if you compare the Old Testament version of Jonah in Greek that Jesus was quoting from in Matthew 12 with what it says in the New Testament in the Gospel of John, the wording is almost the same for these last 2 questions. And he says that he is the reason for the tumult. Now remember, in Jesus' time, the tumult, instead of being waves, was the crowd of people that were crying out and shouting and basically trying to force the occasion. And Pilate is worried that there's going to be a violence breaking out in the crowds around him. So Jonah takes responsibility. He says he is the reason for the storm, just like Jesus was the reason for the angry crowd that was surrounding Pilate. And he says that those who were in charge of the boat, Jonah says, they need to do 2 things in order to calm the storm. He says, lift me up and cast me into the sea. He doesn't just say, throw me into the sea. He says, lift me up and cast me into the sea. Jesus used the same expression. He said, in order for us to be saved, John 3:14, he said, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. Jonah said, you have to lift me up and then cast me into the sea. In John chapter 12, Jesus said in verses 32 and 33, if I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself, signifying the way in which he died, which is on the cross. Now, those who are in charge, in this case Pilate and his wife, don't want to see the prophet from Galilee killed, and they try to find a way out. The sailors on the boat, the mariners, do the same thing. Even after Jonah tells them what they have to do to cast him into the sea to save themselves, they don't want to do that. Pilate tries to find a way out in John chapter 19, but things only get worse, and finally he feels like he has no choice but to hand Jesus over to death, just like the sailors felt they had no choice but to save themselves, to lift Jonah up and to cast him into the sea. The people who are casting Jonah into the sea are concerned about the impact on them. In Jonah chapter 1 and verse 14, they cry out to the Lord and say, please, Lord, do not let us perish on account of this man's life, nor bring righteous blood upon us. For you, O Lord, have brought this about. They are concerned that the blood of this innocent man is going to be cast on them. And that reminds me very much of what happened with Jesus, with the Pilate being concerned and wanting to have his hands washed because he doesn't want the blood of the innocent man on him. He's the one man that Caiaphas, the high priest, not knowing it, in a prophecy in John chapter 11, he said, it's better if one man die for the whole nation than that the whole nation should perish. And this is exactly what happened with Jonah on the boat. It was better that Jonah die than that all the sailors on the ship would perish. And then one last parallel here. Upon the prophets being handed over to death, there's a very dramatic change in nature. And the Gentiles who see what happened fear God and turn to Him. And that's what happens in Jonah chapter 1, verses 15 and 16, with the storm ending, and in Matthew chapter 27, where the earthquake takes place, and the soldier on his side fears God and realizes that a righteous man has been killed.